Hi everybody, welcome back, and today we're going to be talking about grit. Yes, I am recording this video at night. I'm outside in the garden, the weather is lovely, and we're just sitting around and thought, what a better way to talk about something that's actually quite important to our worm bins and for our worm castings. So let's get into it. So first of all, why don't we start with what is grit? Grit is hard, non-digestible particles, usually in the form of eggshells or rock dust, fine sand, and even things like these, which are oyster shells, and ground up, that are rich in minerals and calcium that help the worms digest their food. Now, there is a myth that you need to have grit in your worm bins, that your worms can't survive with grit, which actually is incorrect. There is a lady who I watch all of her videos on YouTube. Her name is Anne. She has a channel named Plant Obsessed. I'll put the link, I'll tag her in the video below. She has a worm bin that's been running for over a year with no grit whatsoever, and her worms are doing absolutely fine. So, do you need worms in your worm bin? No. Is it better for your worms to have grit in the bins? Absolutely. And we'll touch on that now. So what does grit do? Essentially, worms don't have stomachs. They have gizzards. Like a few other animals, like some birds, some reptiles, things like chicken, poultry, ducks, turkey, anything that doesn't have a stomach, some fish that don't have stomachs but have gizzards, use some form of grit to be able to help grind up their food and digest it to be able to pass it through. So when you have things like grit, so this is an oyster shell, which I boiled, then technically roasted to remove all the moisture. It then becomes easier for it to be broken down. And this is just me, you probably can't see it quite well. This is just a half blend. I just wanted to show you guys different stages of what these are. When you add this to your worm chow or into your worm bins or your bedding, the worms use this grit and try to consume it with their food, and it helps grind up the organic matter which you have in those bins. Obviously they can't digest it, it gets pooped out the other side. And what this does is actually helps with the aeration of your bins. The fine particles of grit stop your castings from clumping together. It also really helps with stopping your bins from going anaerobic or some fine compaction. Gardeners have been using things like agricultural gypsum in their gardens for many years. And because it is a form of rock dust, what it actually does, it stops the compaction of your soil, of your sods, of your basically, if you've got clayey soils, it actually breaks that down and allows for better drainage. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is, another benefit of using grit in your worm bins is the calcium and the trace minerals actually help with your worms building stronger and healthier exoskeletons. They're just healthier, they're happier, and they produce worm castings a lot quicker. So I've recently just started using oyster shells, and the reason why I like using these is because they actually aid in neutralizing the pH balance in your worm bins. So over time, your worm bin might get a little bit acidic, depending on what you put in there. These help balance that pH, which some other types of grit actually don't do that. So eggshells, even though are very rich in calcium, don't help in the balancing of your pH levels within your worm bin. Lime actually is a great one for that. Gypsum doesn't. Gypsum is a great form of calcium, but doesn't change the acidity or alkalinity within your soils or your worm bins. And neither does sand. Obviously, fine sand. Sand can actually assist in the increase in acidity within your bins. So I'm not going to advise people not to use it. I'm just saying that I've been using eggshells. I have access to oyster shells, and these are actually quite good because you can get them from your local restaurant. If you eat oysters, you can just take your oyster shells and process them and grind them down, and that's really, really great. So what's the process of doing of getting these to be able to be crushed? So I boil them for two reasons. Number one, I want to try and extract the salts from the shells. That really, I don't want to add high salinity to my bins. It also starts to break down the shells, and then I roast them. Actually, I throw mine into my air fryer for about 20-25 minutes on a high heat, and it just pulls out all the moisture, which then makes them makes them brittle, and then can go into my little grinder here, spice grinder on my food processor, and create a really nice, really fine dust of grit. And that's it really. So I actually use quite a lot of grit in my bins. I don't know if that's bad to overuse grit, but what I mean by that is I include grit in the form of my agricultural gypsum when I create my bedding and have it sitting around, and I don't know if pre-fermenting is the right word, but while it's sitting around and just doing its thing and building up those microbes and breaking down over the course of 4, 8, 12 weeks, while I do quite big batches in one go. So I have the agricultural gypsum in the bins, in the bedding, while I'm waiting to use it in my bins. But then I also crush up my grit and add it to my worm chow. So every time I feed my bins, they get a little bit of that grit in their food, into that bedding again, and it just helps them to go through the food. So even though we now know that grit doesn't have to be used in worm bins for you to have successful castings, I definitely do believe that you need grit in your bins to have better quality castings, more aerated, more fluffy, and less clumpy castings, which will ultimately give you a better final product and a better finished product when you go to use those castings, either in your bin, in your beds, in your vegetable beds, or your flower beds, or your garden beds. And of course, if you are selling your castings commercially, your customers will have a better final product too. What you use is up to you. You have access to a lot of different, depends on what you have access to. You can use more than one different type of grit. I know a lot of people that use oyster shells, and they'll use azomite, and they'll use lime, and they'll use eggshells when they are preparing either their chow or their bins. So they have a number of different types of grit within their bins, which is great. I don't have access to azomite, unfortunately. I don't have access to dolomite lime. I'm sure I could find it if I wanted to, but I have access to eggshells, I've got access to oyster shells, and I have access to agricultural gypsum. So those are the things that I use, and I recommend that you use whatever you have access to, whatever is easy for you to use, because ultimately, obviously, we're trying to keep stuff out of the landfill and help our worms be healthy and compost our waste. And there we have it. That's my 2 cents on grit. If you've enjoyed this video, please, as usual, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and ring that notification bell to be kept abreast of what's going on and new videos coming up. Big love as always. Be well, and see you guys soon.